So if you are active in any game community online, regardless of the game you're playing, I'm sure you've seen a lot of people that complain about this. Sure, sometimes these arguments are derived from people being sore losers, but it's often also true that games don't always really offer a very fair level playing field. Therefore, in this video, I'm going to talk about game balance and how you can make your game a fair challenge, or at least make it feel like one to your players. Imbalance. So imbalance is often thrown around by players to refer to the extent to which a game offers a fair or unfair challenge. But there's actually a lot more to it than just that. When we talk about balancing a game, we're actually talking about the process of adjusting the various elements of the game until they deliver the experience that we as game designers want. So in other words, we're fine-tuning the mechanics of our game in order to derive at our intended aesthetics. However, there's more to this picture than just mechanics. Game designers balance the extent to which a game offers freedom versus control, the length of the game versus the pace of the game, the economic system of the game, or how it rewards its players versus how it punishes them. It even goes into the amount of choices that people are being presented with, and so on. So even if there's a lot more to balancing a game than just making sure that it's a challenge that feels fair to the player, fairness is perhaps one of the most important and maybe the most noticeable aspect of a game that requires balancing. So let's take a closer look at how you balance fairness, and let's start with a couple of sources of unfairness. Now, I'm going to mention 4 of these, but for further reading, I really recommend chapter 11 of Tracy Fullerton's book, Game Design Workshop. Anyways, the first one is called reinforcing relationships. If winning at one element of the game reinforces another element somewhere else in the game, it becomes pretty easy to create positive feedback loops that lead to what we call a slippery slope mechanic. A stronger player keeps getting advantages and advantages and growing stronger and stronger until it just leads to an unsurmountable lead. Next, there are dominant objects. So dominant objects are part of the game that are simply better options for a player to take if they want to do well at the game. So for example, say that in the famous game Rock, Paper, Scissors, Rock would beat Paper half of the time on top of beating Scissors all the time. So with that, Rock would become a much better option than the others because it just got a better chance at winning. Now that might sound really silly, but it's easy to fall into this trap when you design your game. Say your game has a slow and high damage character versus a fast and low damage character. Now that might sound very fair on paper, but what if moving slowly and hitting hard is a much easier to control option to the point that it's just a better option for your players? Well, you'll probably need to balance that. You probably need to increase the damage of the fast character so that the slow, strong character is no longer a dominant object. Third, you want to consider your player's starting position. The resources and abilities that you begin the game with obviously impacts the balance of the game or the fairness. So say you give one player in a game of Monopoly double the starting money. Well, they will have a much better shot at doing well at it, and that also applies to real life. Very few billionaires are really self-made, from Bill Gates to Jeff Bezos to Mark Zuckerberg. While these are all obviously very talented people that made many smart decisions in their lives, most billionaires come from relatively to exceedingly wealthy parents that provided them with a favorable starting position in comparison to most of us. And then finally, there is scripting. Games are often programmed, or scripting as the internet calls it, in ways that compensate for poor AI or high player skill. Sometimes the AI is just not smart enough and they have to be compensated for it. So for instance, racing games such as Mario Kart, they use rubber banding, which is a scripting technique that is designed to make sure that you can never get so far ahead of the AI racers that the game becomes too boring. It's like a rubber band pulling them back towards you. Well, if you don't get hit by that stupid turtle shell, of course. Similarly, games with high strategic complexity often compensate for the AI's inability to outsmart a good player. Now, sometimes games are pretty straightforward and communicate this well. So, for example, Civilization will tell you exactly what perks the AI will get when you play at a higher level. Other games, though, they don't communicate it at all. For instance, Pro Evolution Soccer will have your defensive players run out of position for no reason whatsoever on the high difficulty level sometimes, just to make sure that there's some suspense on the pitch as the AI is getting some easy goals on your team. Now, while I would argue that scripting is best used as a last resort, being mindful of those first three types is actually very helpful to identify issues and potential fixes for your games early on. Furthermore, it also gives you a good idea of what kind of games are harder to balance than others. For instance, a symmetrical game like chess has some challenges in making sure that there are no dominant pieces or that the slippery slope of losing pieces doesn't get too bad. However, even if there are some imbalances in chess's design, they would still be shared by both players, and it's a far easier balancing exercise than an asymmetrical game. For example, the award-winning board game Root. So in Root, players have different starting positions and mechanics, and there are a lot of relationships between these that open up the doors for imbalances when it comes to its fairness. So as a game designer, Root is a very tough game to design. Okay, so does that mean that Root is unfair? Well, not really. For one, the game is designed to self-balance itself, as it's pretty clear to see who's in the lead at any given point in the game, and part of the fun is for the other players that are not in the lead to bring the leader down a notch. So having a faction that is slightly stronger than another isn't really that big of a deal, as players can see them coming a mile away and do something about it. Second, I don't know about you, but I feel that games do not always have to be entirely fair. For instance, I know how to play chess, and I wouldn't say that it's a bad game by any means, but I would say that there's a lot of games that I think are far more fun. Famous web series Shut Up and Sit Down even did an entire series on two-player games that are more fun than chess to illustrate that point, and I would agree with many of their points in that video. You see, when it comes to single-player games, I prefer games that are somewhat unfair challenges because it feels incredibly fun to beat them. So, what about multiplayer then? Well, I love games that are not entirely symmetric because asymmetric games have so much more to offer. For one, they simulate the real world better. So in a World War II game, the Germans can have better tanks, while the Allies have cheaper anti-tank measures and infantry. But it also expands the game space a little bit as well. For instance, in Street Fighter 2, you start playing as Ken versus Ryu, but then you move on to other fighters and there's different possibilities and different complexities. I also like how asymmetric games allow for more personalization so that everybody can play the way they like to play. And that can just be a thematic thing where some prefer gigantic orcs while others prefer the puny but technologically advanced humans. But it can also level the playing field a little bit, where some people play the fast Twitch speed faction while others prefer to play at a slower pace. They also create more interesting situations if you think of it. Just look at Bakchal. That's an abstract game where 4 tigers take on 20 goats. And that is so much more interesting and fun to me as a starting board state than the game of chess. Finally, across all of those reasons, I also like games that are a bit random because people love their RNG. Or maybe not. Well, actually, I think that at heart, people do love RNG. As Grant Kostikian puts it, life is uncertain, and through the way they deal with chance, games give us a safe place to learn how to manage and ameliorate this uncertainty. People just hate it when chance is poorly balanced and the unfairness is beyond their expectations or their tolerance for it. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the methods to balance the fairness of our games so that we can accomplish what we set out to deliver a game that is balanced to be exactly as fair as we need it to be to meet our intended experience. So let's start with the basics and let's look at a hypothetical dogfighting game with 3 planes without considering RNG yet. Let's call them Betsy, Jaws, and Reaper. So Betsy is our bread and butter average plane. She has medium speed, medium maneuverability, and medium firepower. What I would do here is just get a plane moving around in my game engine and then figure out what I feel is a fun amount of speed, a fun amount of maneuverability and firepower, and test it with some people to see if they feel the same way. Next, we design Jaws and Reaper, and we give them the following stats. So this is similar to what you will find in a lot of games. The average one, the fast one, and the powerful one. However, let's see what happens when we quantify this, because on paper this looks good, but when we add it all together, we immediately see that Reaper might be a little bit disadvantaged. So that is one way to look at fairness. Create a simple mathematical model, however simple it may be, and see what that tells you. However, it is often just a good starting point, but not nearly enough to ship a game on. In fact, when we playtested this game, we saw that Joss won 75% of the time, Betsy won 58% of the time, and Reaper only won 8% of the time. Now, I have two thoughts about this. First, you have to approach this as a scientist, since both the math and the playtests are indicating that there is an issue regarding Reaper. This is definitely something that deserves more consideration. However, you want to make sure that you are following a good playtest protocol here, and that these numbers are not just the result of the Reaper players perhaps being less good gamers than the others, or that playing Reaper is simply a matter of more practice. But anyways, let's assume that there is no skill or learning bias between the players here. Second, you want to be sure that this is actually a problem. Remember, balancing is all about what experience you want, not about fairness necessarily. So I'm sure you can imagine that Reaper will be less popular amongst players, and some players who really love the Reaper look might be disappointed with the game. But if your narrative requires Reaper to be more difficult to win with, then you might want to leave things the way they are. Anyhow, let's assume that none of my concerns apply here and that we can safely decide to change the game and adjust the playing stats. Now, there are a lot of ways to do that. For instance, we could make all the numbers add up to the same value. That could be interesting, but it will likely not work if your game prefers speed and maneuverability over firepower. It might actually make Reaper weaker if that's the case. So, in the end, you want to make adjustments and you want to test them. You will likely have some bad adjustments at first, but eventually you'll get better and the game will get to where you need it to be. And while we're at it, here are a couple of tips. First, make big changes, work with doubles and halves. Instead of having fine adjustments, I found that making really big adjustments gets you where you need to be a lot faster. Second, document your process. Make sure that you save versions of your game and that you write down what was changed for specific playtests carefully. Third, try self-balancing techniques. Building in supply and demand in a game or letting players auction for certain items can reveal a lot about what was balanced well and what wasn't. Fourth, consider numerical relationships. Look at what the relationships are between different elements of your game and how they progress through the game. For instance, the Fibonacci sequence is commonly used for an interesting experience points progression curve. Fifth, try modeling your game. Create a simulation of your game using software like Excel or Joris Dorman's machinations. They can be used to run many AI-driven playtests rapidly. But above all, you can't beat real playtesting. The impact of the skill of a player and the shenanigans that they are able to pull are often just too hard to predict, and that actually brings me back to chance and RNG. Because skill and chance, they're connected. Many games require a little bit of both, and actually, skill can often be expressed as a chance. For example, Michael Jordan's skill at free throws could be summed up with a single number, 83.5%. LeBron James, on the other hand, is a less skilled free throw shooter than Michael Jordan at 73%. So, say you are making a free throw shooting basketball board game, you can have MJ roll a 1 through 7 or higher on a 10-sided die to score, while LeBron has to roll a 2 or higher. So, by using probability math, as I just did in that example, you can estimate the impact of player skill in your game and make sure that the amount of chance in the game is balanced fairly. Now, I don't want this video to turn into a tutorial on probability math. I will provide some good examples in the further reading for you to use that. However, I do want to highlight two basic concepts regarding probability. So one, probability can be complicated, but at its core, it's just fancy counting, and you can easily do it yourself while you're designing your game. Let me show you some quick examples. Say, what is the chance of pulling the ace of spades from a deck of 52 cards? Well, let's count the correct options versus the total options. So the correct options here are just one, the ace of spades, right? The total options, however, are the deck of 52 cards. So the solution is 1 over 52, or about 2%. So, see? It's just fancy counting. So what's the chance of drawing a spade card? Well, same deal really. We count 13 correct options in 52 cards, so 13 over 52, or 25%. So keep that in mind. If the amount of options is not that high, you can basically just count them. And if you know about joint and disjoint events, you can even do some fancy counting. So disjoint events are events that are mutually exclusive. Heads or tails, or whether a card is spades, hearts, clubs, or diamonds. Joint events, on the other hand, are independent and can happen at the same time as they don't impact each other. For instance, the chance of tossing heads first and tails the next time, or whether a card you draw is an ace but not a spade. So that brings you to the rules of fancy counting. Disjoint events are added, while joint events are multiplied. So for instance, what are the odds of drawing an ace or drawing a face card? Well, you can pause right here if you want to try it out for yourself before I tell you. So a card cannot be both an ace and a face card, so this is a mutually exclusive or disjoint event. So all we have to do is count both chances and then add them. So we have 4 aces out of 52 cards and 12 face cards out of 52 cards, so that makes for a total of 16 over 52. Fancy counting. So let's do another one. What about drawing an ace and a spade then? That can happen at the same time. So it's a joint event, and instead of adding, we multiply. We have 4 aces out of 52 and 13 spades out of 52. So that makes for a total of 52 over 2,007 and 4, or 2%, which is also the same odds of drawing the ace of spades as we saw earlier. Anyways, the key here is to remember that you can often do this kind of math without needing to be a genius. However, it does get tricky fast. For instance, how about 2 aces in a row from the same deck? Again, feel free to pause right here and figure it out on your own. So the first ace is a chance of 4 out of 52, while the second ace is a chance of 3 out of 51, because that first ace is now gone. And since this is a joint event, we multiply and we get 12 over 2,652, or about 0.45%. Okay, so that was a lengthy example for my first point about probability, but I think it was worth it. While it can be complicated, probability is just fancy counting in the end, and you don't want to be intimidated by it, because fancy counting can really save you from some silly mistakes. You wouldn't believe how often I've had students that would jump to conclusions such as the chance of rolling a 7 with 2 6-sided dice being the same as just rolling a 12. If you know fancy counting, that's just ludicrous. Anyways, if all else fails, here's 2 little tricks that 60% of the time work every time.
That doesn't make sense.
First, there's anydice.com. So this is a site that lets you quickly figure out probabilities for all sorts of combinations of die rolls and even draw up probability curves. And second, if any dice can't even help you, I find that just posting online that you have an extremely complicated math problem that nobody can solve in the entire world will typically get you an answer in about a minute. Moving on to the second and much shorter concept that I wanted to highlight, people perceive probability in the weirdest ways. Take the Civilization series, for instance. When our soldier fights 3 of the computer soldiers, it makes sense to give us a chance of 25% to get a victory. It's 1 in 4 odds of our soldier being the last one standing. However, when players have 3 soldiers going up against the computer single soldiers, playtesting showed that players would get really frustrated at losing that battle 25% of the time. Even though it might be a fair chance, it just didn't feel fair when they lost. So when probabilities get complicated, remember the Civilization example and make sure to get some playtests in. As I mentioned earlier, the issue that people have with RNG is not typically caused by game designers not picking fair probabilities in light of the intended experience, but with those probabilities not being perceived as fair by the players. So looking at Reggie right now, what are the odds that I have a treat in my hand here? What do you think, Reggie? 100%, that's right. Here you go. Alright, so that was my introduction on probability and balancing, and I hope it ends up being useful for you so you end up making the games that you envision. In any case, here are some topics for the comment section. See you next time. Bye-bye.